Content warning: religious oppression, residential schools, bloodshed, terrorism, war, and suburbanites. Action, excitement,
horror, romance,
thrills and chills,
swords and sorcery,
rockets and ray guns,
a dizzying panoply of the strange and impossible from the darkest depths of the human imagination. What mad universe encompasses such tales as these? Join us as we bear witness to the sweeping sprawl of all the history that never was and all the futures that could yet be. It's adventure as you like it on What Mad Universe?
Suppose I am God, said the voice, and suppose I made the world in idleness. Suppose the stars, that you think eternal, are only the idiot fireworks of an everlasting schoolboy. Suppose the sun and moon, to which you sing alternately, are only the two eyes of one vast and sneering giant, opened alternately in a never-ending wink. Suppose the trees in my eyes are as foolish as enormous toadstools. Suppose Socrates and Charlemagne are to me only beasts, made funnier by walking on their hind legs. Suppose I am God, and having made these things, laugh at them. And suppose I am man, answered the other, and suppose that I give the answer that shatters even a laugh. Suppose I do not laugh back at you, do not blaspheme you, do not curse you, but suppose, standing up straight under the sky, with every power of my being, I thank you for the fool's paradise you have made. Suppose I praise you with a literal pain of ecstasy, for the jest that has brought me so terrible a joy. If we have taken the child's games and given them the seriousness of a crusade, if we have drenched your grotesque Dutch garden with the blood of martyrs, if we have turned a nursery into a temple, I ask you in the name of heaven, who wins? Good afternoon. Welcome to What Mad Universe. As always, I'm Adam Prosser, and with me is Philip Rice.
Hi.
Hello. Today we're looking at a book I really enjoy. It's actually a bit of a favorite of mine. It's The Napoleon of Notting Hill by Gilbert K. Chesterton, which was written or published in 1904. And it is, Chesterton was, I guess these days he's best known for the Father Brown novels. He also wrote The Man Who Was Thursday. He was a bit of an influence on C.S. Lewis. And he's a bit of he was a very religious writer. He was Catholic, and he wrote a lot of Christian apologia as well as fiction. And he was also apparently beloved of Marshall McLuhan, if you can believe it.
Okay.
Yeah, so there were a lot of people who, and he's, pretty well known and thought of fairly highly. He's not generally thought of as a fantasy sci-fi writer, but he did write, this book is technically science fiction, and there's one or two other books he wrote that would be considered fantasy or sci-fi, because this one's set in the future. Now, it's almost explicitly avoiding being sci-fi, and yet it is, as we can talk about in a moment.
Oh, it should also, this is his first book, right?
Yeah, it does seem to be his first major published work.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So he did journalistic work. He did, he wrote criticism. He was an art critic, a literary critic. So he was, he'd been writing as a reporter for a while before he did this. But yes, you're right. It's his first major fictional work and his first major work. I actually have a collection of all his novels, and it's the first one. So I guess they're in chronological order. So there you go. But yeah. So what did you think of this, Phil?
It was very interesting. Yeah, it's complicated in its themes because there's stuff I was sort of made uncomfortable by.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he can be. It's uncomfortable for sure. His philosophy was not my own, and probably not yours, and probably really not. It's not the philosophy of anyone. Most people nowadays, like if you really broke it down, it would probably be pretty reactionary. But the funny thing about him was he was very whimsical and very, I guess, open-minded. That's something you see a bit with C.S. Lewis as well, where he's writing in defense of a very, a backward-looking tradition, kind of an old-fashioned, very small c conservative tradition. Um, but he's also, he has an active mind and imagination and can engage very cleverly with art and literature and theology, and as a result, and partly like in this book, for instance, he comes around to viewpoints that we would classify as pretty liberal, even semi-radical, certainly considering that it was written 100 years ago. So that's the weird thing about this book. It's kind of like how J.R.R. Tolkien, he wrote, he was kind of an environmentalist in some ways, even though he was, a very conservative, religious guy, an old-fashioned person in many ways. But he loved nature, and he wrote against industrialization and against the onrushing tide of modernity, I guess. So it became hippies started loving his book for that reason, essentially, right? So,
but just sort of the nationalism of the story is a little uncomfortable, especially in modern context.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that's interesting. Sorry, go on.
Because it's born out of violence. Like, people die in this. It's written very whimsically, but there's like human cost within the story.
Right. Yeah, there's a sense of, well, the funny thing about that is he's a nationalist, and yet the irony is that he sort of defends other, even though he's writing from the heart of the British Empire, he's sort of defending other countries' right to nationalism as well, right? Like
yeah, that's definitely there, because when Notting Hill wins the war of 94, I guess, they don't try to conquer anybody else.
Right. Well, more than that, at the very beginning of the story, it starts with him praising, or rather, I guess, lamenting Nicaragua, which has been, it's been read. I should explain the story here. It's set in the future, which he explicitly goes into an explanation about how very little has changed. Society has become very stagnant from where it was in 1904, except that, essentially the British Empire or the Western values have taken over everywhere.
It mentions great empires, so it seems like all the countries in the world are controlled by a select few empires.
Right. It's sort of, and again, we'll talk about this in a bit, but it's kind of an early vision of globalization and the world just becoming alike everywhere you go. And it literally starts with them meeting the former president of Nicaragua. They're a little vague about it, but they imply that Nicaragua had a bit of a revolution that failed, and the president was deposed, and now he's living in London. And he talks about how, there were specific things about my country and our culture that were great and wonderful, and they're lost now because Nicaragua is like everyone else. It's, quote, civilized, unquote. And the way it's written, Chesterton is very clearly sympathetic to the idea of a country that gets sort of taken over by the West. There's a specific passage, which I'd like to read here, which I really enjoyed. Hang on, okay. So the president of Nicaragua says, "When you say you want all peoples to unite, you really mean that you want all peoples to unite to learn the tricks of your people. If the Bedouin Arab does not know how to read, some English missionary or schoolmaster must be sent to teach him to read. But no one ever says, 'This schoolmaster but does not know how to ride on a camel. Let us pay a Bedouin to teach him.' You say your civilization will include all talents. Will it? Do you really mean to say that at the moment when the Eskimo has learned to vote for a city council, you will have learned to spear a walrus? I recur to the example I gave. In Nicaragua, we had a way of catching wild horses, by lassoing the 4 feet, which was supposed to be the best in South America. If you are going to include all the talents, go and do it. If not, permit me to say what I have always said, that something went from the world when Nicaragua was civilized." I mean, that's a very, enlightened, even by modern standards, viewpoint.
That's a good point. It reminds me of uh, attitudes around, say, residential schools for Native people in Canada. Um,
Yeah, exactly.
sort of, not sort of, but yeah, driving their own culture out of them and forcing them to assimilate by threat of violence.
Right. And it is very interesting because the story itself is set in, like, it's sort of set in the mindset of a comfortable British person's, upper middle class British person's world, where the rest of the world is kind of hazy. And he literally establishes this is what the whole world is like, and revolutions have died down. There's no revolutions anymore because everyone's happy with how it is. But he talks about it from the point of a British person. And if it was just that, you'd say, well, Chesterton had a very narrow view of life. But then he literally confronts you right at the beginning with, well, here's someone whose culture was annihilated by that, and they're talking about how you guys have taken all this for granted. He literally spells it out in so many words. So right from the start, it's confronting what he says in the first chapter, where, oh, the world's the same, nothing has changed, progress won't advance, the world will always just be like this. And then this guy saying, well, what's the world? It's the world that the British people like, in your case, or I guess Americans, the major powers,
Mhm.
and taking for granted that they'll always be there and that they'll always be, powerful, essentially. Um,
Um, Going back a bit at the very beginning, when it talks about other writers' predictions for the future.
mhm,
I found that really amusing that people just take what's happening now and just extrapolate it. So what's happening
right.
now, but more so. So that's what H.G.
Yeah.
Wells did and what Jules Verne did, and um,
Yeah. Well, I
and
mean, even today, that's what people do.
yeah,
It's always, if this
uh,
goes on, we'll all
yeah,
have,
the cyberpunk thing in the '80s and '90s. It's a lot of it's very dated even already. So I mean,
right.
some of it's come true,
It's
but
act, yeah, it's actually interesting that you bring up cyberpunk, because that was, I know we were talking about last week or last time about Nova, where that was kind of a forerunner of cyberpunk. In a weird way, I almost feel like this novel has some very, very early tenuous ties to cyberpunk, not with in terms of the technology, because Chesterton does not care about, technology or high tech things at all,
it's been
but just
utterly
in,
unchanged. If anything, it's regressed a bit.
right, right. But in this case, but the vision of globalization is something that affects a lot of cyberpunk stories, and so some of the themes he's dealing with here become relevant in cyberpunk novels when they deal with, the idea of, like, because Chesterton doesn't specifically say capitalism has taken over the world, but that's sort of, you can sort of imply from what he's got, because he's, even though he says there's still a king and in fact a despotism of controlling England and presumably a large portion of the world. He also mentions that the king is kind of a functionary. He just signs papers that are put in front of him, right? he doesn't.
Yeah.
He doesn't actually have that much power, or rather, there's not that much power that needs to be exercised because everyone's sort of content. Everything's just sort of going along to get along, as it were, which
hmm
implies a heavy, neoliberal capitalist society, essentially.
yeah. Also,
Without,
the central conflict is about building a road through a community.
that's right. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, he says the populace has a hobby in confounding the prophecies that people make, and nowadays there's so many prophecies that you'll have to go with one of them. But the people of the year 1984, which is when the novel starts out, did confound those prophecies because nothing's really changed.
Right.
Like
Yes. But,
technology is the same, people dress the same, it's just
right.
the same but more so.
Yeah, that's him. Yeah, that's as always with Chesterton. He'd follow an idea he found amusing, and I almost feel like that was just his weird joke that he decided to follow through on for the rest of the novel. Even though it's actually not, it's not even technically true because things
No,
kind
but
of have changed.
yeah.
But he just basically says, he's talking about, and I'm sure there were a lot of people like this in the 19th century where people would say, well, in the future we'll all stand on our heads because it'll be, it'll increase the circulation to our brain power, and therefore we'll be, super evolved intelligences. It's that kind of mindset which, the late Victorian era definitely seemed to embrace as the idea of, and then followed through into American culture in the 20th century of, well, we're going to keep evolving and we're going to become super beings, and all of the stuff that we're doing now is going to take us, into the future and make us better than we are, and but it's all going to be based on our technology now advancing in a direct line. And he comes up, Chesterton comes up with all these deliberately ridiculous examples of that, like everyone becoming a vegetarian, which was popular at the time. Vegetarianism was a big thing in that era, and it was seen as an advancement of mankind not to eat meat anymore. So now he's saying, like, there were people who said, no more eating vegetables because it's cruel to the plants, and we can subsist entirely on salt. And then he said there was going to be someone coming along saying, why should salt suffer? Basically, right?
I'm a level 9 vegan. I only eat things that don't cast a shadow.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, I also want to draw attention to the first line of the story, which is really good. The human race to which so many of my readers belong.
Yes.
That's just a great line.
Yeah. Chesterton's a very witty writer. He's got a very elegant prose style that's very funny. It is interesting because that whole first chapter, which is almost a nice little standalone joke of a mini story in and of itself in predicting the future, it sort of sums him up because he is having a joke and he's being ridiculous and mocking the concept of modernity. That's Chesterton in a nutshell. He's very whimsical and witty, and has a not postmodernist but a very sort of ridiculous view on life, while reinforcing a bit of an old-fashioned view of life and saying, we should appreciate, the traditions, and not and the march of progress is ridiculous and silly, and let me mock it. Not that he wasn't above, making fun of and having jokes about older styles of life, but he tended to revere that in a way that, he would mock modern life in a way. And there's quotes of his where he says, which gets shared by like right-wing people these days, where he says things like, well, it's become very disreputable to be a Christian these days, and the kind of you see the victimhood that emerges from a lot of these guys coming out in his writing. But he had a sense of humor about it. At least he was a little more willing to embrace silliness. He kind of that's actually sort of what the book is about. It's about the reverence of silliness and nonsense and not taking yourself too seriously. But by the same token, you could almost say he's almost got a South Park attitude in some ways of, it's silly to have passion to improve the world. Ha 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 ha. Let's all go back to medieval Catholicism. In a way that was his worldview. So it does get a little bit uncomfortable when you get into it.
So the story itself, like we said, it starts off in the year 1984, which, as an aside, has been suggested that was the inspiration for the title of Orwell's famous novel, though that's disputed, of course. There's other theories, and it's not quite clear where that came from, but that's one thing that's put out there. Most of the action actually takes place 10 years later in 94, and there's a coda at the end. It's set in 2014, so
right. And yeah, that's right. It jumps forward. It actually spans a fairly large period of time. But the premise basically is that, so one thing that has changed about this world is they don't have a primogeniture for picking the monarchs of England anymore. They just basically randomly select someone to be king of England every time.
Not basically. That's it. They just people are chosen at random with the idea that democracy is based on the idea that any idiot, can have a share of the power. So why not just make it efficient and give just some random idiot all of the power?
Right, and that's a good example of what I'm saying, where he's not above mocking tradition as well, because he points out that, well, being the child of a king doesn't give you any inherent powers, and everyone realizes this nowadays. It's essentially random. It's just been transferred genetically. So why not pluck a random person out of the ether to be king? I'll read. There's a segment of the book here. I'll read. It says, "We are." This is the guy defending to the Nicaraguan president the current system. "We are, in a sense, the purest democracy. We have become a despotism. Have you not noticed how continually in history democracy becomes despotism? People call it the decay of democracy. It is simply its fulfillment. Why take the trouble to number and register and enfranchise all the innumerable John Robinsons when you can take one John Robinson with the same intellect, or lack of intellect, as all the rest, and have done with it? The old idealistic Republicans used to found democracy on the idea that all men were equally intelligent. Believe me, the sane and enduring democracy is founded on the fact that all men are equally idiotic." Anyway, and so on. But and now the character speaking is not necessarily reflective of Chesterton, but he is, again, he's kind of just, he's doing a, oh, it's all such a the world is such a ridiculous system kind of thing. But
So yeah, but the person who's selected as king in '84 is somebody who takes nothing seriously, just jokes all the time, which is the appropriately named Oberon Quinn. Oberon, of course, being it's spelled differently, but the King of the Fairies in Shakespeare, and it predates Shakespeare, but yeah, it's popularized by that.
Right. And I mean, he actually makes an explicit reference to the fairies at one point in the book. Yeah.
Oh, a couple times, but yeah, it actually draws him back to Shakespeare's Oberon at one point as well.
Yeah, yeah.
He comes after he's declared king at random again. He comes across a child on the street playing, as a knight, and he in jest salutes the kid, and does sort of condescends to him that he's a great hero and all that, and talks in sort of medieval type grand speeches about nobility and all that. And that inspires him to remake the character of London. So all the little boroughs in London, he sort of made up a new history for each one of them. So they're all, according to him, he puts together the charter of cities. So they're all at one point were independent states that like warred with each other, and they all have their own symbolism. And there's a good quote here. Do you want to read this?
"I trust that very few of you, at least, I need dwell on the sublime origins of these legends. The very names of your boroughs bear witness to them. So long as Hammersmith is called Hammersmith, its people will live in the shadow of that primal hero, the blacksmith, who led the democracy of the Broadway into battle, till he drove the chivalry of Kensington before him, and overthrew them at that place, which, in honor of the best blood of the defeated aristocracy, is still called Kensington Gore," and so on. Yeah, he creates a whole mythos. And I mean, it's funny because this is taking place in London, which really does have thousands of years of history. So I almost feel like, it doesn't come across as much to a non-UK reader because, for all we know, this could be true, right? But if you don't know the history of London, but it's the equivalent of saying, those of you in Manhattan will remember the great battle between the Manhattanites and the Brooklynites, where the Red Hook Republic declared it's talking about these just random neighborhoods as if they were glorious ancient kingdoms with their own traditions and so forth.
And all the weird names are like symbolic of some actual literal thing that existed. So and later on they have Knightsbridge, and there's an actual knight on a bridge.
Right. And the Kensington comes
and it would be like if Yellowknife in Canada was actually like there was a yellow knife.
Right. Well, I mean, I think Yellowknife was actually named after a minor gold rush that came there, and that the knife discovered some gold in the river, so it's actually
okay.
more or less accurate, I think. I could be
Okay,
wrong. Maybe
never
not.
mind.
But
I know nothing about the history of my own country. Sorry.
well, I don't know Yellowknife. No, I could be wrong too, but I always got the impression that's what it was. I mean, to be fair, a lot
But
of
like Medicine Hat.
yeah.
We have a lot of silly names in this country.
That's right. I mean, they do tend to be named after something that happened there. That it's usually pretty straightforward, but it's true. But yeah, it's the fact that he gives it a this ancient historical backdrop that goes back hundreds of years is the part that makes it silly. And then he makes them all dress in their ancient livery with sort of a medieval style to everything. There'd be the burghers,
and they have to be accompanied by trumpeters and
right. And he talks about how he made a random
things.
yeah, he made a random like shopkeeper the burger of whatever borough it is, and
I think it's Provo.
sorry, the Provo. And then he says he complains that it's annoying to have his heralds following him around everywhere because he can't get any work done and like all that kind of nonsense. And of course, so Quinn knows this is ridiculous. That's why he's doing it. He's having a big laugh about it. He thinks it's the funniest thing in the world.
I just want to inject that quote that Adam read earlier was actually the initial inspiration, according to Neil Gaiman, for the novel Neverwhere.
Mm.
And you can see a lot of that in it with the place names taken literally. There's even a Knight's Bridge scene I recall in the miniseries.
Yeah, he does it all based on weird puns essentially, and says if you go to Knightsbridge, if you go to Earl's Court, there's literally an earl who has a court in a subway traveling under the city, and there's one or two other things like that are based on well-known neighborhoods and subway stops in London, and he's sort of taken them into a fantastical level. So it's a bit like that. I always said if this novel was written, nowadays, Notting Hill, it would be essentially a guy who turns the city into a giant Dungeons and Dragons game, or I don't know, a board game anyway. Where he puts everyone in charge of, and everyone's miserable. But then what happens is that 10 years later, as they're talking about...
sorry, I had one more. Sorry.
Go ahead.
A lot of this also reminds me of a lot of modern British comic writers like Grant Morrison and Alan Moore often have like mystical aspects to cities. Like early on in The Invisibles, they go through the true, London is Luandun, the city of the moon, which is an actual myth, but,
right.
It's probably not the real title, but yeah, the real origin of the word London, but yeah. So there's like a mystic aspect underground of what these cities sort of represent.
Right.
Oh, also,
that reminds me.
Come to think of it, Hawksmoor from the Authority comics, he's the sort of god of cities.
Right. Well, there's a legend which got, I think, referenced in From Hell, where that Boadicea, I believe that's how it's pronounced, who was what was she? The Celtic queen of Britain?
Something like that.
She was a warrior queen.
She was a warrior queen.
Yeah, and I believe she fought the Romans. And there's a legend that she's buried somewhere under like the one of the main train stations in England is actually around the site of where her burial tomb would have been. So somewhere.
Oh, right. This played into Moore's League of Extraordinary Gentlemen Century comic as well.
Right.
Oh, it's also where Harry Potter got on the train, so that ties in. Right,
and it's also the same place that was actually bombed in the London bombings of I believe it was 2007. When there was that terrorist attack on a subway platform. So it made it a place of mystical significance, essentially, that there was some... And then, of course, just recently, a few years ago, they discovered the body of Richard III under a parking lot, if you remember, in England, too. So it's got that same idea. And in England,
bring it back to cyberpunk, and it's weird that we keep doing that with this book, but it reminds me, like, the character of cities as, like, in cyberpunk, it's not so much a mystical thing, but the city is like an all-important thing. It's the environment that the characters live in. and this story,
Yeah.
they sort of worship, or at least Adam Wayne sort of worships the city as because he's never known anything else.
Right. Well, let's talk about Adam Wayne. So that's the turning point of the novel, where 10 years after all this has happened, the kid who he ran into on the street, the titular Napoleon of Notting Hill, shows up to the king, and there was a plan to build a roadway, I believe, through an old building to make a larger road through Notting Hill, and he shows up and basically says, "My liege, I demand the right to sort of defend my territory." And Oberon Quinn starts laughing and going, "Oh my God, this guy finally is playing along with my gag," because everyone else has just been complaining and going along with it because he's the king, but treating him like a mad king, basically. But this guy comes forward and really plays into it and says, "Oh, I must defend my territory, my great lord." And as the conversation goes on, Quinn realizes that no, wait, he takes this 100% seriously. He's absolutely invested in the mythos that I've created as a joke. He thinks it's 100% noble and serious, and that he's he's the defender of Notting Hill, and that he's this great knight who has to defend. And again, there's a sort of aspect of it's the forces of progress rolling through my quote country, but it's Notting Hill, which is apparently a bit of a dingy suburb of London. It's not a particularly glamorous or interesting place, but it's all he's ever known, and as a result, it's something he's willing to die for. And literally, London ends up going to war over Notting Hill. That's what the novel turns into. Because
that scene was really interesting with Oberon just sort of realizing that holy crap, he takes this seriously.
Yeah.
It sort of reminded me of an old clip from John Oliver on The Daily Show begging Donald Trump to run for president because it would be hilarious.
Right.
And
yes.
Yeah. You can just imagine, it dawning on him when,
right.
The whole thing happened.
And now, I mean, that's almost a different situation though, because in that case it was sort of, but you're right. It's sort of, oh, this would be hilarious if it happened, and then it happens. It's not hilarious at all. But
Yeah.
it shows how when you produce something, ironically or ridiculously, very eventually, it gets taken seriously. I've heard it said, I don't know if it's true, that the subconscious part of your brain does not understand the concept of irony and doesn't understand, that level of mockery, essentially. So if you keep presenting it with an idea, your subconscious will start to assimilate it and accept it. As Kurt Vonnegut,
yeah, that's the theory of how flat Earth has become so popular.
Right. Yeah. There's a quote from Kurt Vonnegut in Mother Night. He says, "We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful what we pretend to be." I think that applies here. It's the idea of, once you do something, no matter, you can't put quote marks around something. The quote marks will fade away eventually, and that's what happened here. This guy Adam Wayne has become a religious fanatic. This old, he's this very, he's this wonderful. He's a Don Quixote figure, essentially. It's the same idea as Don Quixote, where it's a ridiculous figure of nonsense. But because he's got something noble at the core, the nobility emerges out of it, essentially.
As you said, this turns into an actual war. He manages to convince people to rise up and fight for this little borough of London.
Right.
The battles which happen later on in the book are actually pretty brutal. They don't involve any guns because there's been no battles since the Nicaraguan thing, and that's happened years ago. So the fighting is with swords and spears and what have you. But because nobody was, expecting this sort of thing to happen. But otherwise, it really feels like sort of urban warfare that we see nowadays in Iraq and whatnot.
Right. Exactly.
There's strategies of getting around, into alleyways and around,
Right. And it's sort of it's got the the idea of, well, everything from the American Revolution to the Vietnam War, where the people who know the place who live there, even though they're less armed, they've got the advantage because they know the terrain and they know, they can strike without warning, whereas the armies marching down the street with heavy cavalry can be at a disadvantage if they don't know the
Yeah,
terrain.
there's one character who keeps insisting war is just a matter of mathematics. That
Right.
you have just say the other side can fight for as each man can fight as well as two men, so you get three men against him, that sort of thing.
Right.
But that's not really the case, as we see in, like you said, Vietnam and other areas where it can be a matter of people defending their homes versus people who are going in and don't really want to be there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is definitely funny because if this book was written nowadays, you would say, well, okay, he's doing a commentary on globalization and imperialism and colonialism and all that kind of stuff. But it was written in 1904. It was written before the 20th century. Admittedly, the British Empire had been, and before that, the Spanish Empire had been going strong, and there'd been aspects of this. But I think you could argue that well, I mean, the British Empire did have this sort of, well, there's a cozy capitalist modernity at home while we're fighting, to quote, civilize these countries far away who are, fighting for their land and their homes. Again, it's very obvious Chesterton's sympathies is with those people over the empire, as it were, which makes it ironic that he's such a booster for the British Empire, right? Like it's kind of weird. He's almost what's the word? He's almost a like a Rand Paul type or a Ron Paul type who's saying, well, America's great, but we should stay home and not get involved in other people's politics, right? That's almost the conclusion to draw.
Yeah, there is a bit of that, especially like I said, some of the nationalism is uncomfortable, but I also recognize that some nationalism, like the nationalism of getting an empire out of your home, is actually very necessary for
Right.
marginalized cultures.
Yeah, he takes like I say, he takes his own national. I couldn't find the exact quote, but there's another Chesterton quote from one of his nonfiction books where he says, we might describe something that we have a love for, and there's an obvious reason that we love it. Because we love this guy because he's our friend, because we came up together and we shared experiences and so forth. But then you have something like your family, your mother, for instance, who you love because she's your mother, and that's just the person who happened to give birth to you. And then he said to your country, which you love because it's the country you live in. And some people criticize that by saying, well, but you could have been born anywhere. You just happen to love this country because it's where you were born. So there's no logic to that love. And Chesterton said, well, my response to that is, that's the most powerful kind of love there is, the love for something that doesn't have a logic or a reason to it. You love it because it's your own, not because you know that circumstances could have changed it completely, of course. But you still love it anyway, because even though you can't explain why you love it, you just do. That's obviously a factor in this novel as well. And I mean, he more or less says this. Adam Wayne more or less says the same thing about Notting Hill. That it's his, it's the place that I love because it's where I grew up. It's where I fell in love. It's been my home this entire life. As you say, Adam Wayne never gets out of the city. He never has a chance to experience anything but Notting Hill in his life. And therefore, it's a place that must be defended, whereas someone else might just say, yeah, sure, knock down that building. It doesn't matter. We've got to put a road through. He says, no, it's what I am. It's my place in life. And it's meant to be a bit ridiculous that that I'm so attached to this small suburb, and yet it's something that I love and that I'll passionately defend. And that makes me noble and wonderful because I have that love, essentially.
Yeah, there's an interesting part where we read some of Adam Wayne's poetry
Right.
that he wrote before he started all this, and it describes, other poets will describe the beauty of a city by comparing it to the country, or the beauty of a person, or the beauty of a concept by comparing it to nature, or something like that. But Wayne just compares everything to the beauty of the city or aspects of the city. So like the stars in the sky are as beautiful as a lamppost, you know?
Right, and yeah, the wind came around the corner as fast as a cab, he says at one point. And it's like, most people would compare the cab to being as fast as the wind, but to him, the
Yeah,
stuff that's in the city is the nature, and he's talking about nature, he's going to compare it to the stuff he knows, which is the city, right? Um,
yeah.
so yeah, this novel, it's very much Chesterton having all these sort of rich ideas that he's packing into this story. Um, and yeah, as I said,
But on nationalism, revolutionary nationalism,
mhm,
Michael Collins, the early 20th century Irish revolutionary,
mhm.
was reportedly a fan of this book. So that's an interesting
Yeah.
aspect.
So and again, it's so funny because Chesterton would have defended the British Empire, uh, to his last breath and said, it's great. Now, it's possible, but again, reading this book, you kind of do feel like, well, maybe he would have sided with the Irish nationalists too, because they were, yeah. I think in practice, I don't know if he ever wrote about it because, of course, he was alive for a lot of the early troubles. But I think that he probably would have sided with the British Empire, despite what he wrote in this book. But it is funny, as I say, because he just takes nationalism to such an extent to its logic. He's willing to take his idea that would be considered conservative, but he takes it to such an extent that he ends up granting it to everyone else and saying, it's good to be nationalist, even if you're fighting the British Empire, which is the nationalism that I defend, right? So he at least that's the thing about Chesterton. He's willing to take his ideas to their logical conclusions and grant that empathy to everyone else instead of trying to pretend that well, that's why the British Empire must conquer everyone else. And the kind of people the modernists that he's making fun of, on the one hand, we might say, well, they were more progressive maybe, but on the other hand, there was a lot of arrogance in the Victorian mind, as it were, as one might argue there is in our own society these days, where they think they know best, and even the ones who are trying to be, good and advanced people and compassionate would often say, well, we know better than everyone else, so we're going to make everyone else follow our rules. And Chesterton actually is pushing back against that to an extent in the novel, and in a lot of his other work. It's worth commenting on, I think.
Yeah. So and some of the battles are interesting because, like you said, they're based on knowing the terrain. So at one
Hmm.
point they knock out the light posts, the lamp
Right,
posts, so that the enemy can't. They don't know their way around and they're in complete darkness, so they
right,
get slaughtered.
right. And then I believe the master stroke is he seizes the waterworks at one point at
Yeah,
the conclusion, right?
yeah, and
Is
he
it the
threatens
Kensington
to flood
waterworks?
everyone. Yeah, he threatens to flood everyone else if they don't give in to their demands, which is just leave us alone.
Right. And
Uh,
there you go. It's almost a foreshadowing of terrorism if you want to get technical about that. It's like, do what we say, if you if or mutually assured destruction, if you like. I mean, on a
mhm.
very low scale, but it's kind of like, yeah, we'll destroy it. I love it so much I'm willing to
Oh,
destroy it.
this novel is dedicated to the brave Mujahideen fighters of Afghanistan.
Essentially, yes, it's that. That's
Oh,
actually
for those who don't know, that's the original ending to Rocky 3 had a or was it Rocky 3?
yeah, Rambo
Okay,
3.
yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Rambo. Sorry, not Rocky. Rocky's
No,
about a
no,
boxer.
no.
Rambo 3 is set in Afghanistan, and he fights alongside forces that would eventually become the Taliban.
Right.
The original ending credit said it was dedicated to the Mujahideen.
Yeah. So it's pretty, and it's funny because that's another example of the same thing that I'm talking about, where your own nationalism, when you extend it to other people, you end up basically defending people who are fighting your own imperialism, basically. So that's exactly the same thing. They said, oh yeah, the Mujahideen are great. In that case, they were fighting the Soviets, which is why they were. And it was funny because it's a jingoistic Reagan era gung ho idea, but it's turned around after a few decades into, whoa, those aren't our friends at all. Why are we supporting them? So that's the irony
Um,
there.
But it's also interesting that Adam Wayne, his demands are just to be are for their own independence, not for.
Right.
He says, "We won't conquer you like you tried to conquer us,"
Mm-hmm.
and that's interesting. The way of a lot of um, sort
Yeah.
of native pushback against oppression
Right.
uh, is talked about. Like
Mm-hmm.
we don't want to take your land, we just want our own.
Right. Exactly. And again, that's now clearly Chesterton was reacting, and again, he's in the weird position where he's as a booster of the Queen and England. He's not going to say down with the British Empire, but he's essentially saying, yeah, the British Empire should leave everyone else alone and let them have their own country. That's a much better thing. But I know that Chesterton didn't like revolutionaries much either. If we get, we're hoping to eventually maybe do the Father Brown stories, and he he definitely has some sort of contempt for socialists and revolutionaries and people who are trying to overturn the order from within the European society. I guess he's more sympathetic to them if they're fighting back against British imperialism outside their society. So it's a bit of a weird worldview in some ways for 1904, but it's definitely one that is kind of amazingly farsighted in some ways.
Also, at the coda at the end, which is actually a couple chapters long, like it's not really a coda. I
Yeah.
misspoke there, but that takes place 20 years in the future, and Adam Wayne's ideas have spread all across the city, so all the boroughs are doing this, and they're erecting statues to the heroes who fought in the Battle of Notting Hill against Notting Hill, and Notting Hill, the people are trying to get that taken down, and Adam Smith has a speech about, we won because we not only won the battle, but we actually sort of spread our ideas, like we started something.
Mm-hmm.
Like he compared them to Athens or Nazareth. And he said, the least we can do is allow other people to have their own version of this.
Mm-hmm. Right. But then, the battle ends up at the end. It's funny because both Adam and Oberon end up on the side. There's another battle at the end, and they essentially say, "Well, we're on the wrong side this time, but we have to do it anyway because of nationalism." Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that, in a sense, you could call that a bit of a response to the earlier idea of, well, then there's a time when it's bad, basically. I'm just saying that he's fighting. He's saying we were on the right side then, but now 10 years later we're sort of on the wrong side and fighting for Notting Hill because we're not fighting to defend our territory. We're fighting to how did it go again? We're fighting for our territory, but we're fighting to we're on the wrong. They acknowledge they're on the wrong side basically, but they have to do it out of nationalism, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of like, you could say that's the response, that's the pushback. It's not just nationalism is great. It's like, well, there is a dark side to nationalism where you end up basically trying to expand and infringe on other people's sovereignty, and this is what happens.
But it ends with the speech you started off the show with about where Oberon admits that this whole thing was just a big, practical joke, and
right.
They sort of discuss their different worldviews, where Oberon didn't take anything seriously, and Adam Wayne took everything seriously.
Right.
And it ends with them sort of walking off into the sunset together as like they're two halves of one man. So
right.
they're sort of
they're dead.
Two halves
don't forget at this point. They're basically ghosts at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the idea is they're both sort of they're not complete because they represent the two sides of human nature.
Right. And as I said in the quote that I used at the beginning there, it's a very powerful message that I'm actually finding very very moving, which is the idea that if you're handed something as a joke and you take it seriously, you've lent it nobility and dignity, no matter how ridiculous it was. That there's actually again, that's the Don Quixote thing, right? Like the idea of someone who who's ridiculous, but because they have that inherent nobility, that they'll invest anything with nobility, and that's in many ways the point of the novel. It doesn't matter what you invest with that nobility. It's the nobility itself that's important, but you have to attach it to something.
Yeah.
And this is Adam Wayne attached it to a neighborhood in Notting Hill, but I mean, in a sense, Oberon Quinn is almost a godlike figure, because he's just sort of, I created the system as a joke, and you took it seriously and made me go, wow, you guys are cool, basically.
Yeah, what you said about infusing something with meaning. Again, back to Alan Moore. He worships the snake god. What is it? Addiscenton?
Glycon.
Oh, Glycon. Yeah. Sorry, no, Glycon. Yeah, sorry, I was thinking of the a completely different magic thing. Sorry, but yeah. And he admits that this was just a fraudulent puppet that was created in Roman times. As a scam. But he says it doesn't matter, because it's the act of worshiping that matters.
Yeah. I'm not claiming. Right. I may not be an expert on, the occult or the spiritual, but I get the impression that's an idea of, magic, as it were, as its modern day practice. It's not about, the thing itself. It's about investing it with meaning.
Yeah, that's why, say, Lovecraft deities are popular gods to pray to, even though they were made up by a weirdo in Providence or whatever.
Aleister Crowley, who we'll be talking about in a little bit, had some of the same thing, where he basically created a god who he started praying to. But yeah, it's that kind of, like, you create your rituals and you adhere to them. You don't have to believe in them. It's not about belief. It's about investing it with meaning and, transforming yourself, essentially. But that's getting a little mystical, and Chesterton wouldn't have approved of this kind of thing. But that's...
No, but I mean, it's there. Like, it's... Like, whether he intended it or not, this is This is a reading that you can make reasonably.
I mentioned Vonnegut. Have you ever read Cat's Cradle? Do you know that one?
Yep.
Yeah, if you remember, they created a religion that they knew was nonsense to start with.
Oh, right, yeah.
And even the guy who was created to be the demonic figure of the Balkanist religion, he was a Balkanist. He was like, I'm doing my part in this religion by being the bad guy, but when I die, I want to be, I want the ceremonial rites to be Balkanist, because I still worship him, even though I'm supposed to be the enemy. And, we know it's a made-up religion, but it still has a lot of, it's what we believe in, and it gives us power in that sense. So,
and that also ties in, because it was a nationalistic religion, so that's interesting as well.
Yeah, exactly. It
ties into this.
It's a sort of, there has to be specificity, so you may as well be specific to the things you've been given that you like or that you want to cling to. I mean, there has to be also, the flip side of that is you have to be free to reject something that was imposed on you if you legitimately don't like it, right? And that's what a lot of people get into when it comes to tradition versus modernity. It's like, well, I don't want to be stuck with this particular, with this formalism. I want, to make my own way in the world. But then you find your own specificity in something else, right? Anyway, getting a little philosophical there, but I think we're at the end here. Well, that's it from us here on What Mad Universe. We're Adam Prosser, the cynic, to whom everything is a joke, and Philip Rice, the fanatic, to whom nothing is. We want to give special thanks to Alex Ross, the alphabetically chosen king, and the theme song was by Jack Feerick, former leader of the Nicaraguan Revolution. Until next time, we'll see you around the neighborhood. Take care.